Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 396 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the amazing sea monkeys. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to stick around to the end of the episode, as we'll have your feedback on our recent episode on John Hendrix, the Tennessee Prophet. But first, in 1960, a man named Harold von Braunhut began marketing mail-order pets that became known as sea monkeys. You could hatch them with ordinary tap water and keep them in a glass or an aquarium. They were advertised in comic books with compelling artwork. They were billed as delightful, playful little creatures that the whole family would marvel at. And Jimmy himself had sea monkeys as a kid. But the sea monkeys are connected to a series of disappointing revelations, some of which are really wild. So, who was Harold von Braunhut? What are sea monkeys? And what are the disappointing revelations they're connected with? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So, Jimmy, where does our mystery begin today?
Well, it begins with my childhood, but it's going to go to some really weird places. Now, like a lot of little boys, I was into comic books, and I read all different kinds of comic books. I read children's comics, weird mystery comics, monster comics, war comics, humor comics, Western comics, science fiction comics, including early Star Trek comics and Space 1999, and unique genres like Turok, Son of Stone, which featured Native American main characters up against dinosaur opponents, which was really cool. Of course, when I was growing up, the most popular comics were about superheroes, and I read a lot of those. I read some Marvel comics like Daredevil, Thor, and the Fantastic Four, but I mostly read DC superheroes like Batman, Superman, and the Justice League. And I've made no secret of the fact that my all-time favorite superhero comic is The Legion of Superheroes, which features a team of young superheroes from the 30th and now the 31st centuries. So you get science fiction and superheroes. What could be better? I've sought to have a complete run of all the Legion's appearances, starting with their origin from 1958. They've been rebooted several times since then, and each run has had something to contribute, except for the disastrous 2019 Brian Michael Bendis version, which only lasted 12 issues and which I found basically unreadable. So if you're interested in checking the Legion out, I don't recommend starting with that one, but with some of the older comics. But they all are my all-time favorite group. And in 2006, I was delighted when the Legion finally got its own animated TV series that lasted for 2 seasons. I'm happy to report that it was quite good. So you might check that out to get a sense of whether you'd like to read some of the Legion comic books. Also, I still read comics today, although today I normally buy them in digital form because it's easier to store and read them that way.
It sounds like you read quite a lot of comics growing up. How did you afford them all?
Well, it was easier for a child to do that back then than it is now. Until 1961, a normal comic only cost 10 cents, which would be worth $1.11 today after all the inflation the government has caused. 1961 was before my time, but when I was buying comics, let's say in 1971, the average price had risen to 15 cents or $1.22 after all the government-caused inflation. By 1981, the price had risen to 50 cents or $1.87 today. In 1991, the average price was $1.75 or $4.22 after all the inflation the government has caused. And it's still basically in that range. Today, the average price of a comic book is still about $4. So an average comic was the equivalent of a little more than $1 in 1961. It stayed in that range in the 1970s. It didn't cost more than the equivalent of $2 until the mid-1980s, and then it jumped to the equivalent of $4 by 1991 and has basically stayed there.
Why did that happen? Why did they go up so much in relative price?
There are several factors that have played a role. One of them is the fact that the average comic book reader today is older than back in 1961. The typical comic book reader today is an adult, and adults have more disposable income than children do. So comics are no longer priced to be for an audience of primarily children. Of course, adults also expect more for their money than children do, so there has also been an improvement in print quality. Today, comic books are printed on much better paper, often glossy paper, and they use new techniques in image production. Everything isn't just flat images made out of patches of solid color surrounded by black lines. Now, some comics are even full-color paintings. So they're also using much more sophisticated printing techniques to please their audience, and that increases the relative price. Then there's the fact that the comic book market has shrunk, which means that they don't make as much profit per unit sold as they used to. So the average cost has also risen for that reason. But there's also another factor that was helping keep the price of comics down in the old days, and that was advertising. If you read a comic today, it will carry advertisements for other comic books published by the same publisher. But those don't generate any net revenue for the publisher, those ads. So you're paying full price for the comic. However, in the old days, comics used to have lots of advertisements from people who didn't work for the publisher, and they had to pay for these ads. So in addition to the 10 cents you were spending to buy the comic, the publisher was also getting money from the advertisers, and that helped keep the price down.
This leads to the next phase of our mystery, comic book advertising. How much outside advertising did there used to be in comic books, and what kinds of things did they advertise?
There was a lot of outside advertising. There could be as many as 10 pages of ads in a comic book, and with a typical page count of 32 pages, you would commonly get like 22 pages of story and 10 pages of ads. So basically, a third of the comic was advertisements. And they would advertise a whole bunch of things that they thought kids were interested in, either to purchase them with their own money or to get their parents to purchase for them. For example, there would be ads for snacks like Hostess fruit pies, and often the superheroes would feature in these ads. So you'd get a little one-page story where Spider-Man or Batman defeated villains using Hostess fruit pies. Or sometimes they'd offer you Hostess cupcakes and Twinkies and baseball cards. Or if you were in the mood for something savory, a cartoon werewolf would sell you Slim Jim's meat sticks. And if you had some apples laying around, you might use your Vincent Price shrunken head kit to make shrunken heads out of the apples. In earlier decades, there were a lot of ads for self-improvement courses like bodybuilder Charles Atlas's Dynamic Tension exercise program that was supposed to pump weaklings up into manly men. These typically featured a short comic story about a skinny guy getting bullied by someone else, having sand kicked in his face in front of his girl, who then dumps him, only for him to use the Charles Atlas course, get ripped, and then turn the tables on the bully and win the girl. There were also ads for BB guns, especially Daisy BB guns, and if you've ever seen the 1983 film A Christmas Story, where young Ralphie really wants to get a Red Ryder BB gun for Christmas, well, that was a real thing. There was a character named Red Ryder, and Daisy did manufacture a BB gun with the Red Ryder character advertising it as a Christmas gift. Though by my own day in the 1970s, the Red Ryder character had been retired, and they were just advertising the BB gun itself as a Christmas gift. You could also get 100 plastic toy soldiers and fight battles with them. Many of these were World War II era soldiers, but you could also get Civil War era soldiers, and they included both blue and gray armies, so you could always make sure that your preferred side won. Or you could get Revolutionary War era soldiers and have the thrill of throwing off the shackles of our former British overlords. No offense to our former British overlords. Or for ancient history buffs, you could get ancient Roman soldiers. You also could get toys based on the popular 1970s Daredevil Evel Knievel, or the TV hero The $6 Million Man, or any of the many incarnations of G.I. Joe going all the way back to the beginning when he was just a basic military action figure. But if war wasn't your thing and you were more into peace in the late 1960s and 70s, there were also ads for embroidered patches that you or your mother could sew onto your jacket or jeans. These patches were 3 inches wide and they cost 75 cents, which would be around $6 or $7 in today's money. And it's really fascinating to read a page of them and note all the different perspectives that the patches were appealing to. You'd have a peace sign next to a stop sign, next to the word love in heart shape, next to a Playboy bunny symbol. You'd have a hand colored like an American flag making the peace sign, next to an Egyptian ankh, next to a skull and crossbones with the word pollution. There's an old ecology flag with the peace sign superimposed on it. There's a smiley face. There's an American flag, a Confederate flag, and a Black is Beautiful patch. There are patches advertising the Woodstock Rock Concert, the Motor Oil STP, and the beer Budweiser, as well as characters like the Roadrunner, Wile E. Coyote, Flash Gordon, Popeye, and Felix the Cat. There's one that has Olympic circles and says USA Drinking Team, and another rather desperate sounding patch that just says, "Help, I need lovin'," which you might need if you spent much time on the USA Drinking Team. You know, what a jumble of different things you find on these old embroidered patch ads. And if you bought 3 or more of the patches, they were only 69 cents each. In the 1980s and later, there would be video game ads like for Atari and Nintendo, both for the individual video games you could buy and the consoles that ran them. There were also ads for things like bubblegum, and you could get what were basically 7-foot-tall plastic posters of monsters like Frankenstein or a skeleton that you could hang on your wall for just $1. Or if monsters weren't your thing, you could get hang-ups of Batman and Superman that had movable arms and legs so you could pose them. Then there were also full-page ads for novelty items like a flying helicopter toy, a bag that made laughing sounds, realistic-looking fake vampire blood, a book of 2,000 insults, giant 8 or 16-foot balloons, which I assume were just surplus weather balloons, a joy buzzer that you could put in your hand and then shake someone else's hand and surprise them, or you could wear your own monster hands, perhaps to prevent others from using a joy buzzer on you. You could also pair your monster hands with a werewolf mask. You could get a miniature radio or a miniature camera or onion-flavored gum, glasses that would let you see behind you, or the famous X-ray spectacles. There were all kinds of novelty items you could buy.
And that brings us to the main subject of today's mystery, because one of the items you could buy were the famous sea monkeys. What can you tell us about them?
Well, the idea for sea monkeys was apparently originated in 1957 by a man named Harold von Braunhut, and we'll tell you more about him later. According to the website seamonkeys.com, with a hyphen between sea and monkeys, they were first marketed in 1960. Originally, they were marketed under the name Instant Life, which sounds pretty exciting. Who wouldn't want instant life? And I found a very early advertisement for them, which we're going to read to you to get a sense of how they were originally marketed.
Instant life sea animals. Just add water. You've got instant life. Only $1. It's true. Now, right before your eyes, in just 24 to 72 hours, a happy troop of hundreds of playful tumbling sea monkeys that are more fun than a sea full of seals. Amaze both children and adults as you watch the comic antics of these fantastic underwater sea clowns. Day and night, you'll see them chase each other in a playful game of hide and seek. The loser gets caught by the tail and is spun in a dizzy circle. See the show-offs turn somersaults underwater. See the ticklish ones scratch each other's backs. Watch them cavort singly or glide gracefully in formation, creating your own underwater circus. Miracle of life. Right before your eyes, these genuine live sea animals burst forth from magic powder eggs, which will remain alive as long as 8 years. You can raise an entire troop in an ordinary glass jar using just tap water. It's so easy. Just empty the package into a jar of fishbowl, add water, and you have created instant life. You can have a whole sea brew to give as gifts or sell if you wish. See them obey your silent commands. Darken the room and watch them follow a flashlight or candle beam forwards, backwards, sideways, or around like a pack of happy kids playing Follow the Leader. Order now. See them change color. Mail this coupon and we'll send 3 colors of sea monkeys: white, pink, and red. These are their natural colors. Yet, with a drop of vegetable food dye in their water, you can change the color of these little sea monkeys as often as you wish. Make them green, blue, purple, yellow, or any other hue or shade without harming them. This dye will enable you to see their internal organs and how their life processes function. Money back guarantee. Bargain Company, Department, MCT 101 East 32nd Street, New York. Rush me my magic eggs for hatching my live sea monkeys at once. I understand if I am not 100% delighted, I may return it for a prompt refund of my purchase price. I enclose $1 plus 25 cents shipping charge for one order. Say 50 cents, I enclose $2. Send double order for hatching 2 live sea circuses. Name, address, city, zone, state.
So how exciting does that all sound? Really cool, huh? But Harold von Braunhut was looking to improve his salesmanship, and in 1962, he changed the name from Instant Life to Sea Monkeys. I found a slightly later ad that now markets them under that name. It repeats a lot of the text from the first ad we read, but now, instead of saying Instant Live Sea Animals, the headline reads, Grow Amazing Live Sea Monkeys. The ad also says you will receive a magnificent, fully illustrated Instant Life handbook with instructions, tricks, training, and amazing life history. It also assures parents that a 6-year-old child can raise them successfully. But most significantly, the art has been replaced. The original ad featured a fairly crude drawing of what looks like a human bursting out of an egg. But the new ad features a really cute pink sea creature peeking out of his egg in the act of hatching. This image was drawn by an artist named Henry Lamoth and is now known as Hatchie. The new ad also contains a picture of a tabletop aquarium that has a group of 6 adult sea monkeys swimming or resting in it. But even better art was coming, because soon the sea monkey ads were using art by a man named Joe Orlando. Joe Orlando was a longtime comic book artist, and I've read lots of comics that were drawn by him. He worked extensively for Mad Magazine, where he did many cover illustrations. He also worked for DC Comics, where, among other things, he co-created the superheroine The Huntress, who was the daughter of Batman and Catwoman on Earth 2, Helena Wayne. For a time, he was also vice president of DC Comics, so he was a serious comic art professional, and it was natural for von Braunhut to have him do sea monkey ads. And this is where I came in, during the era of the Joe Orlando sea monkey art. This was when I started reading comics, and so I saw lots of these ads, and they were really cool. Joe depicted the sea monkeys as a nuclear family with a mother, a father, a young son, and a baby, and they were often standing in front of a purple underwater castle. The sea monkeys themselves were pink. Each had 3 antennae with balls on the top sticking out of their heads, kind of like crowns. They also had a ridge down their back and long fish-like tails. The ads would also frequently feature a human family marveling at a fishbowl containing the sea monkeys and their castle, and you could even order a special plastic sea monkey aquarium. Sometimes the sea monkey family was depicted as larger, with a ton of sea monkeys swimming or waving at you, the reader. There were a bunch of variations on these ads, sometimes with the sea monkeys playing games like hopscotch. As a little boy, I was really taken with them, and I imagined what it would be like to have an aquarium full of such delightful creatures and the adventures I could have watching them. I mean, how cool would that be? Other people were also taken with the idea of sea monkeys. Not only did countless people buy them and their aquarium, in 1992, there was even a Saturday morning TV show called The Amazing Live Sea Monkeys. It was the story of 3 sea monkeys named Bill, Dave, and Aquarius, who originally lived in a tiny house in a fishbowl, but they were enlarged to human size by a professor. And the professor was played by comedian Howie Mandel. And the group then had adventures in the human world. The series was short-lived, running for 11 episodes, but that's not bad for a Saturday morning children's show. And it was another illustration of how the sea monkeys and their fantastic world could capture people's imagination.
Okay, we told the listeners that the sea monkeys are connected to a series of disappointing revelations, some of which are really wild, but so far, everything's been fun, happy memories of childhood. So now it's time to get to the disappointing revelations. But first, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Linda C., Jacob D., Matthew D., Dominic M., and Paul D. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. More than 90% of our financial support comes from individual donors like you. You can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by Triumph of the Heart, an award-winning film that tells the story of St. Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish priest imprisoned in Auschwitz who volunteered to take the place of a condemned man. This is a compelling look into one of the most astounding stories of World War II, encompassing both the horror and heroism found in a Nazi death camp. You will be deeply moved by the light of hope shining forth from the darkest place on earth. Triumph of the Heart is now available for streaming, so go to kolbemovie.com to secure your streaming link. That's kolbemovie.com, KOLBEMOVIE.com. And by François Flippen, CPA, specializing in tax preparation and consulting for construction businesses and real estate transactions in Virginia.
As Christmas approaches, we're reflecting on 20 years of StarQuest Media, thousands of episodes, and hundreds of thousands of listeners. As we look forward to our 20th anniversary in 2026, we want to launch new shows and reach new hearts. That future depends on our patrons. Your monthly gift is matched up to $15,000, and the first 400 patrons to join or increase by $10 will receive a signed Mysterious World sticker. Visit sqpn.com/give to become a patron today. Thank you and Merry Christmas.
So, Jimmy, you've mentioned how entrancing you found the sea monkeys as a boy based on Joe Orlando's ads for them. We've also mentioned that you actually got some. What was the experience like?
Well, one of the things you found out if you ordered from many of the ads appearing in comic books back in the day was that what you got in the mail often left something to be desired. A lot of the novelty and other items were basically very cheap and flimsy, which is how they could afford to advertise and sell them for so little money. And there was a range of quality levels. In some cases, what you got did exactly what was advertised. In some cases, they did something that was kind of like what was advertised, and in some cases, they were basically useless.
Then, to get a sense of that, let's look at some of the other things that Harold von Braunhut marketed before we look at the sea monkeys.
At the top end of the spectrum for von Braunhut was something he called crazy crabs. These were advertised as amazing, air-breathing land crabs that did not need a fishbowl and lived on land. And that was all basically kind of sort of true. What crazy crabs actually were hermit crabs. And when you ordered one, you got a hermit crab in a cardboard box. But the ad was pretty honest about that. For example, if you look at the illustrations, there's a pretty realistic picture of a hermit crab crawling on someone's finger. So you got an accurate sense of the size and shape of what you'd be getting. You might find that hermit crabs were not as exciting as the ad made them sound, but That's a subjective assessment, and you basically were getting what you ordered. A step down from that, in the middle of the spectrum, were another of von Braun's products, the famous X-ray specs. The ads for these often showed a person wearing spectacles and looking at a hand, and the hand was drawn in such a way that it looked like you could see the bones inside of it. Or sometimes the person would be looking at the outline of a shapely woman, and you could see through the outline of her dress. Now, as a kid, you might think that the spectacles really emitted X-rays and that you'd have the equivalent of Superman's X-ray vision. But from an adult perspective, you'd know that there is no way a comic book ad would be allowed to market a device that really emitted X-rays to children, not even in the super unsafe 1960s. They also certainly wouldn't be able to sell it for $1. And if you know anything about science, merely emitting X-rays would not let you see inside things, because you need the X-ray source to be on the other side of what you want to look at. That's how a fluoroscope works. And so an adult would realize that there is no way these spectacles work the way that a child might think they do. And if you read the text of the advertisement, it basically admits that.
X-ray specs, a hilarious optical illusion, $1. Scientific optical principle really works. Imagine, you put on the X-ray specs and hold your hand in front of you. You seem to be able to look right through the flesh and see the bones underneath. Look at your friend. Is that really his body you see under his clothes? Loads of laughs and fun at parties.
So the ad says this is an optical illusion. It says you may seem to be able to look through the flesh of your hand and see the bones. And it just asks the question, when you look at your friend, is that really his body you see under his clothes? So the text of the ad, which the child is likely to completely blow past, is avoiding legal liability by noting that this is just an illusion.
So what did you actually get if you ordered X-ray specs? How did the illusion work?
Well, you basically got a pair of novelty plastic glasses with cardboard lenses. The lenses had the words X-ray vision printed on them, along with a bunch of red and white spirals to make them look strange. At the center of each lens was a little hole, and that's what you actually looked through. And in the original version of X-ray specs, there would be part of a bird's feather in front of the holes that you looked through, so that the tiny little barbs of the feather would diffract the light bouncing off of whatever you were looking at, creating two overlapping images. Where the two images overlapped, well, the image would be darker, and there would be a lighter fuzzy border around them. So if you looked at your hand, you'd see a fuzzy outline of a hand with a darker hand inside of it that you could pretend were the bones. Today, they don't use bird feathers to create this illusion, and modern X-ray specs use specially designed plastic lenses that diffract the light by themselves, but it's still just an illusion and not what many children would likely expect.
If that's a middle-of-the-range item, what's something that's a step down from that von Braunhut marketed?
I would say it was his invisible goldfish. According to SeaMonkeys.com, they came with a small glass bowl, invisible goldfish food, and a humorous guarantee that their owners would never see them. But this was a total joke item. The joke was that you didn't actually receive any goldfish. That's why they were invisible. You just got a bowl, a fake packet of food, and a guarantee you'd never see them. So that's something I would consider pretty bottom of the barrel. If you didn't know the joke when you ordered them, you'd be extremely disappointed and mad that you had wasted your money.
Okay, so if that's the range of quality von Braunhut's items could have, where did Sea Monkeys fall on the scale? What was your experience when you got them?
Well, we're now coming to our first disappointing revelation, and this is the least disappointing one. We've got 3 more revelations to go, and they only get wilder. When you got a kit of Sea Monkeys, it came with 3 basic pouches that you add to water. The first thing you do is put 10 to 12 ounces of distilled, bottled, or tap water into a container, like a plastic Sea Monkey aquarium that you may have also bought. Then you tear open the first pouch, which is labeled water purifier, and mix the contents into the water. Afterward, you wait 24 hours to let the water purifier purify the water. This packet contains salt and an agent to neutralize chlorine in case you used water that had been chlorinated. But even if you use distilled water that contains no chlorine and is perfectly pure, you still needed to use the water purifier packet because the water purifier packet also contains a secret ingredient that will pay off the next day. Then, after you've waited 24 hours, you tear open the second pouch, which is labeled instant live eggs. You stir those in as well, and then, assuming all goes well, if you look closely, you'll see tiny wriggling sea monkeys in just a few moments, instantly. That's why the sea monkeys were originally marketed as Instant Life, and why the words Instant Life are still associated with the product. Because you instantly see living creatures as soon as you mix in the second pouch. That's pretty impressive, and there's a secret to it. You remember that I said there was a secret ingredient in the first pouch. That secret ingredient was actually sea monkey eggs. So you've already had sea monkey eggs gestating in the water for 24 hours when you pour in the second pouch, and some of them have already hatched. When you pour in the second pouch that is labeled instant live eggs, it does contain more eggs, though there are actually more eggs in the first pouch than there are in the second. It also contains salt and some sea monkey food, which is basically yeast and a blue-green algae known as spirulina. And finally, the second pouch also contains a water-soluble dye that will slightly color the water in your container. That will make it easier to see the sea monkeys that have been hatching since yesterday. So you add the dye and wham, suddenly it's easier to see them. So you get the illusion of having truly instant life. After you've stirred in the second pouch, your sea monkey colony should be up and running and thriving. And then every week after that, you add the kind of contents of what are in the third pouch, which is labeled growth food. This also contains salt, yeast, spirulina algae, and more sea monkey eggs to keep your colony topped off so that you have a fresh influx of new sea monkeys every 7 days, even though they don't tell you that. There are also other packets you can get. They have names like Plasma 3, Red Magic Sea Monkey Vitamins, and Sea Medic Sea Monkey Medicine. But the first 3 pouches are all you really need. The others are enhancement products.
Okay, so far we haven't hit the first disappointing revelation. The process seems pretty simple, even if they do trick you by putting sea monkey eggs in the pouches labeled water purifier and growth food, so that you get the thrill of seeing instant life when you put in the second packet, and so that your colony's population is replenished over time. Those things would actually increase customer satisfaction. So what's the disappointing revelation?
The disappointment comes when you actually start looking at your growing sea monkeys. They start out very small, and you can see them swimming around with the naked eye, but they don't look much like the creatures in the ads. They don't look like the original Hatchie, and they don't look like the little toddler sea monkey in Joe Orlando's art. Still, they've only just hatched, and baby life forms often don't look like their adult forms, so, give it some time. But as the days go by and the creatures start assuming their adult forms in a week or two, they continue to not look like the illustrations from the comic book ads. In fact, they look almost nothing like the pictures in the ads. You may even see a lot of sea monkeys swimming around, but they just don't look like what the artwork promised. And for marine biologists, it's really clear what sea monkeys actually are. They're what are known as brine shrimp. Specifically, they are what's known as Artemia salina, although some sources claim that they're a hybrid species known as Artemia neos. Any way you go, they're not the same as the fanciful creatures that Joe Orlando and others drew, so that's the first disappointing revelation connected with sea monkeys.
Now that we've established what sea monkeys are scientifically, what do we know about Artemia or brine shrimp?
Well, they're a small crustacean, and they're actually pretty cool, even apart from the sea monkey marketing. They are found all over the world, and they typically live in saltwater lakes, although they're also found in the ocean sometimes. They can live in waters with very high salinity, up to 25% of the water being salt. And by living in inland saltwater lakes, they are able to avoid many of the predator fish that live in lakes but are freshwater fish instead. This is also why the sea monkey packets contain salt, so that the tap water you may use gets its salt level high enough for them. Artemia can grow up to half an inch or 12 millimeters long. They typically live for 2 to 3 months, which is why you need to keep topping off the population of your sea monkey tank. And in their adult form, they have 3 eyes, with one small eye right in the center of their foreheads and 2 large compound eyes, one on each side. So 3 eyes is pretty cool. They can reproduce either sexually with males and females mating, or an individual female can also lay fertile eggs if there are no males around, which is also interesting. Their eggs are known as cysts, and the cysts can last for a really long time. They go into a state known as cryptobiosis. Kryptos is Greek for hidden, and bios means life. So cryptobiosis means hidden life. This is basically a form of hibernation, so that the eggs can hibernate literally for years until the conditions are right for them to hatch. They can even survive in cryptobiosis on dry land and just wait for the right watery conditions to appear. That's why they can be kept for years in pouches waiting to be shipped to children all over the world. The eggs can survive in temperatures way below freezing, down to temperatures as low as negative 310 degrees Fahrenheit, which is negative 190 degrees Celsius. And they can survive above the boiling point of water, up to 221 degrees Fahrenheit or 105 Celsius. So they're very hardy little animals. Not quite as tough as tardigrades, but still very tough. Because so many of them can be bred so quickly, they are often used as a fish food, especially in aquaculture and fish farming. They're also used in toxicology, where they can be used as a model organism for testing toxins or poisons. And they've been taken to space multiple times to test how well they survive radiation and extreme acceleration. Astronaut and Senator John Glenn also took the brand sea monkeys, not just brine shrimp, but specifically sea monkeys, into space on the shuttle Discovery in 1998. Reportedly, he took 400 million sea monkeys with him into space. So they've had some pretty cool adventures in the real world, not just in the fantasy world of the comic book ads.
Let's talk for a minute about the man who started marketing Artemia as sea monkeys, Harold von Braunhut. What should we know about him?
Well, he was born in 1926 in Memphis, Tennessee, but he grew up in New York City, and he reportedly held 195 patents, mostly for different toys. His family was in the toy business, with his maternal grandfather, Tobias Cohen, being the head of the T. Cohen Superior Toy Company, which itself has an interesting history. Harold himself also had an interesting life story, and the official Sea Monkeys website has a biography of him that says,
"Imagine a guy who invented X-ray specs, crazy crabs, and invisible goldfish. Meet Harold von Braunhut, the mad genius born in 1926. Starting as a young magician and inventor, Harold later worked on the first GPS system for NYC's subway. When he wasn't dabbling in his inventions, he raced motorcycles, using the stage name the Green Hornet, and he managed a stunt diver, Henri Lamoth, and a mind reader, the amazing Dunninger. But Harold's most legendary creation is, and always will be, the amazing live sea monkeys. One fateful day in 1956, Harold wandered into a pet store and saw vats of brine shrimp, tiny aquatic creatures usually fed to fish. With the spark of inspiration, he envisioned them as instant pets that could teach kids about nature's oddities. He began tinkering in his lab, and by 1960, he introduced these critters to the world as instant life. Sea monkeys seem to magically spring to life. How? That's a closely guarded secret involving osmosis, pH levels, and some top-secret chemicals. The original formula is still made in the USA and kept under lock and key. Initially, sea monkeys didn't resonate with retailers due to Wham-O's unsuccessful instant fish product. So Harold had a brainwave, advertise them in comic books, and sell directly to kids. It worked like a charm. Kids everywhere were soon ordering sea monkeys by mail, eagerly awaiting their instant pets. Despite early success, there was still a problem. Sea monkeys didn't live very long. Harold teamed up with marine biologist Anthony D'Agostino to create super sea monkeys that were hardier, grew bigger, and lived longer. By 1986, these new and improved sea monkeys could live up to 2 years. Sea monkeys have swum their way into millions of homes in pop culture. They went to space on the Space Expedition Explorer with astronaut John Glenn in 1998, starred in their own Saturday morning TV series, and made cameo appearances in shows like South Park and The Simpsons. Hobbyists and collectors even gather on social media to discuss all things sea monkey. Over the decades, these tiny pets have also found temporary homes in wristwatches, necklaces, and racetracks, continuing to spark imaginations everywhere. Sadly, Harold von Braunhut passed away in 2003, but his legacy lives on thanks to his wife, Yolanda Signorelli. Yolanda, a former model and actress, has not only kept the Sea Monkeys empire alive, but also dedicated proceeds to a nature preserve on the Potomac River in Maryland. An ardent vegan and animal rights activist, Yolanda views sea monkeys as goodwill ambassadors for a better world. From their quirky origins to their lasting impact, sea monkeys have captivated generations. Thanks to Harold's wild imagination and Yolanda's dedication, these tiny creatures continue to bring joy and curiosity to kids and adults alike. So next time you see these little critters in a tank, remember, they're not just shrimp, they're amazing.
So those are the basic facts about Harold von Braunhut and his sea monkey empire. But there's something that the official sea monkey website isn't telling about him. This brings us to the second disappointing revelation connected with sea monkeys, or more specifically, with their creator. And this is where things start to get wild. According to an article published in 1998 by the Washington Post,
inventor Harold von Braunhut of Charles County, Maryland, has surfaced in recent months as an active supporter of the Aryan Nations, an anti-Semitic white supremacist group. Von Braunhut recently was reported to have pledged part of the proceeds of one of his inventions, a spring-loaded, whip-like weapon known as the Kyoga Agent M5, to the legal defense of Aryan Nations leader Richard G. Butler. Butler was acquitted April 6th of sedition charges at Fort Smith, Arkansas. We've long been monitoring Harold von Braunhut, said Erwin Sewall, fact-finding director for the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. He's linked to some of the most extreme racist and anti-Semitic organizations in the country. He has a reputation of being a generous contributor. Von Braunhut's reputed generosity manifested itself in a fundraising appeal in December from Butler, the Aryan Nations leader. Butler enclosed a Kyoga brochure and said that the manufacturer has made a pledge of $25 to my defense fund for each one sold to Aryan Nation supporters. He directed purchasers to write AN for Aryan Nations in small letters on the order form. Butler plugged the item as a fine article for self-protection, and all whites are going to need all the protection they can get in the near future. Photographs taken at a Charles County Planning Board hearing last month show von Braunhut wearing the Aryan Nations lapel pin. Butler told the Spokane, Washington Spokesman Review in January that von Braunhut was a longtime friend and a member of the Aryan race who has supported us quite a few years. Butler was traveling and could not be reached for comment. The term Aryan is used by Nazis to mean a Caucasian of non-Jewish descent.
So wham, Harold von Braunhut, inventor of sea monkeys, was reportedly a supporter of Aryan Nations, an anti-Semitic white supremacist group, and he was reportedly a generous donor to Aryan Nations causes and legal defense. What a disappointing revelation. But that's not all. The Washington Post also reported,
"It is the Kyoga Agent M5 self-defense weapon that has stirred the most controversy. Von Braunhut was arrested in 1979 on an illegal weapons charge in New York City for carrying the spring-coil device. The charge was dismissed after a judge determined that the weapon did not require a license. Thereafter, von Braunhut promoted the $59.95 item as perfect if you need a gun but can't get a license. The product has been advertised in The Spotlight, the weekly publication of the right-wing Washington-based Liberty Lobby, and in the Aryan Nations newsletter as part of Butler's fundraising."
And listeners may remember The Spotlight from episodes 391 and 392 because it published a story about CIA agent E. Howard Hunt being involved in the JFK assassination. Hunt sued the paper for libel, but the jury found that the article did not libel him. Of interest here is that one of von Braunhut's 195 patents, which were mostly for toys, was for a spring-loaded weapon that he promoted as a substitute for a gun if you can't get a license for a gun, like if you're a convicted felon or something. The Post continues,
Von Braunhut was listed among a group of outstanding Aryan nationalist leaders featured at a 1984 Aryan Nations Congress held at Hayden Lake, Idaho. His affiliation was listed on the program as Imperial Order of the Black Eagle. Von Braunhut was a leader of the Imperial Order of the Black Eagle, which operated in New York City in the early 1980s, according to the Anti-Defamation League. At meetings held at the Estonian House in Manhattan, speakers included the Reverend Robert Miles, a Fort Smith, Arkansas defendant who spoke June 9, 1982. In advance, an Imperial Order newsletter billed Miles as a famous opponent of the communist Zionist conspiracy, who is nationally known in rightist political movements that reflect the highest aims and ideals of the white race. Sewall said that the Imperial Order was more of a forum than an activist organization. He said that the Anti-Defamation League was unaware of any activities of the Imperial Order since von Braunhut moved from Manhattan to Maryland. A Harold von Braun was listed as speaking on behalf of Reverend R. Butler, Aryan Nations, at a Washington Sheraton meeting February 12th of people advocating repeal of the 14th Amendment, which granted to blacks as citizens equal protections of the laws. Robert Brock, a California black separatist who organized the program, said Butler, scheduled to stand trial then, recommended von Braunhut as his substitute. Brock said he called von Braunhut at his Maryland home. At the meeting, Brock recalled in an interview, von Braunhut sat in the back as if he didn't want too much exposure. He was kind of a mysterious guy. He made a statement in favor of the separation of the races, and he got out. Also, von Braunhut was mentioned in an indictment of a top Ohio Klansman in 1985. Grand Dragon Dale R. Roysch was fined $5,000 and given 3 years probation for violating federal gun laws. The indictment, which did not charge von Braunhut, said he financed Roysch's $11,954 purchase and took possession of the 83 automatic pistols, rifles, and revolvers between November 1980 and December 1981. Among the pictures adorning the walls of his study in Charles County are a German war poster autographed in 1940 by Hermann Göring, an inscribed photograph of Benito Mussolini, and a print of World War II German aircraft signed by the Luftwaffe's top 4 aces.
So, yikes, this is not painting a friendly portrait of the whimsical sea monkey inventor, but von Braunhut did defend himself and try to portray himself in at least a somewhat better light. The Post reports,
in an interview in January with the Maryland Independent, a Waldorf newspaper, von Braunhut deflected questions about his political activities. I'm not burning any crosses on my front lawn. I'm not holding secret Black Eagle meetings or racial meetings or KKK rallies. I'm not bringing any ideology to the area. As the committee spokesman of SWORD, Save Wildlife, Oppose Riviera Development, von Braunhut has published ads in the local newspaper sounding apocalyptic themes, with references to Judas goat business experts and rhetoric urging residents to join our struggle for God, country, and our American heritage for self-determination. I love the United States. I support the Constitution, von Braunhut said in an earlier interview. I'm a very viable individual. I'm not sinister at all.
And at least some individuals thought that von Braunhut did come off as a personable guy in some situations.
Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas M. Bauer, who prosecuted Royce, said the defendant and von Braunhut were friends. He said von Braunhut was prepared to testify at the trial that he had lent Royce the money for the purchase and then took possession of the guns to secure the loan. The trial was called off after Royce pleaded guilty to one count of illegally transporting firearms across state lines. Von Braunhut was very cooperative and pleasant with us, Bauer said. He brought some of his little toys along, including the sea monkeys.
This is all really distressing stuff, but you promised that there would be a third disappointing revelation this episode. Surely it can't be any wilder than this one.
Actually, it can, because there's an even wilder revelation about von Braunhut himself. Back in 1988, the Washington Post also reported,
the 62-year-old supporter of neo-Nazi groups was born and raised in New York City as Harold Nathan Braunhut, a Jew, according to relatives and other sources. Questioned recently about his Jewish background, von Braunhut said, I will not make any statements whatsoever unrelated to his present battle against a $2 billion development known as Riviera, proposed for a site adjoining his 70-acre Potomac River estate in Bryans Road, Maryland. Von Braunhut subsequently did not respond to phone calls and messages regarding this story. I'm not going to involve any of my activities, political, religious, business-wise, in the issues at hand, von Braunhut said in an earlier interview.
So it appears that not only was Harold von Braunhut a supporter of anti-Jewish neo-Nazis, people who would have approved of the Nazi Holocaust back in the 1940s, but he was actually Jewish himself. That's our third disappointing revelation, and this is about as wild as it gets. The Post then fills in the details of how they came to this conclusion.
In an interview last month, von Braunhut said his family moved from Memphis to New York City in 1931. He said he moved to Charles County from Manhattan about 4 years ago in search of a tranquil, rural environment. I escaped from New York, he said. According to family members and the Anti-Defamation League SUAL, von Braunhut is Harold Nathan Braunhut, born March 31, 1926 in Manhattan.
So pay attention to that. He was born Harold Braunhut, but he later added the German honorific von to his name to become Harold von Braunhut. That would make him sound more Germanic and distance himself from his Jewish family. This also explains why his maternal grandfather was named Tobias Cohen of the T. Cohen Superior Toy Company, Cohen being a Jewish name that means priest. So if your name is Cohen, you're regarded as being a descendant of one of the ancient Jewish priests. The Post continues,
he is the son of Jeanette Cohen and Edward Braunhut, both Jewish. His mother's family was in the toy business. His father had a printing shop. I'm not going to discuss anything with you, von Braunhut said in response to a reporter's questions about his family. Von Braunhut is not the first person of Jewish background to become active in the anti-Semitic neo-Nazi right. In 1965, the New York Times disclosed the Nazi identity of Daniel Burroughs, a high-ranking Klansman and former American Nazi Party member who then shot himself to death. In 1978, Chicago Nazis rallied under the leadership of Frank Collin, the son of a Jewish concentration camp survivor. His family name had been Cohn. Von Braunhut's first cousin, Herman J. Braunhut, a retired Yonkers, New York high school social studies teacher who now lives in Deerfield Beach, Florida, recalled him and his family from years ago. They were as religious as most other Jews, Herman Braunhut said. I know they went to synagogue during the Jewish holidays. I believe he was bar mitzvahed. I was probably there. He remembered that the cousin he knew as Harold Braunhut was in the toy business and was always fooling with different kinds of gadgets. Von Braunhut's father died December 30th, 1957, and his mother was killed in a car accident January 7th, 1960. Funeral services for his mother were conducted at a Jewish chapel on Fort Hamilton Parkway in Brooklyn. The funeral home records include the phone number of von Braunhut's former wife, providing another link to him. Both parents are buried at Wellwood, a Jewish cemetery at Pine Lawn on Long Island. Wellwood records show that a Harold Braunhut paid a one-time fee of $1,296 in 1979 for the cemetery to provide perpetual care of the graves. Von Braunhut's first wife, with whom he has a son, still lives in Queens, New York. She said she is in occasional contact with her former husband in Maryland and knows of his inventions and remarriage, but she said she was unaware of his other activities. I find this a little mind-blowing, she said, when told of his anti-Semitic associations. I would certainly not call him a left-wing Democrat, but this is incredible. This sort of shocks me. Harold von Braunhut's brother was married in what the bride's sister recalled as a big Jewish wedding, and their son was circumcised by a mohel, a religious official in the traditional Jewish ritual known as a bris. Von Braunhut and his first wife were divorced in 1968, the former wife said. Some years later, he married his present wife, the former Yolanda Signorelli. In an interview, the man known as Harold von Braunhut said he attended the City College of New York and Columbia University, but did not obtain a degree. Columbia records show a Harold Nathan Braunhut attending business school in 1945 to 1946. The address he gave at the time was 2901 Ocean Parkway in the heavily Jewish Brighton Beach section of Brooklyn. He said he served in the Merchant Marine, was a race car driver, got involved in creative product design and development, and produced a television show. His toy company maintained a sales office and display room at 200 Fifth Avenue, the toy industry building that housed his mother's business. Callers to the New York office are referred to the Bryans Road, Maryland phone number. His best-known invention may be the sea monkeys, hybrid brine shrimp eggs that come to life when immersed in water. His other products include a mad scientist monster lab. His patents for these and other inventions are in the name of Harold N. Braunhut. His earlier patents and registered trademarks give a New York address. Recent ones give Bryans Road. The Anti-Defamation League, SUAL, said rumors have circulated within the extreme right wing about von Braunhut's Jewish background. But they felt he was a solid, dependable, extreme right-winger regardless. That he's one of them and can be trusted.
So the Post assembled some very substantial evidence that Harold von Braunhut was in fact Jewish, and he wouldn't discuss the matter with the paper, so it looks like they were absolutely right about this.
Phew! Is there anything else we should know about Harold von Braunhut?
Well, there is one thing. There is a fourth disappointing revelation, which is this. The Washington Post reports,
Von Braunhut, who often dresses in black, said, "A close friend prevailed on me to become ordained in 1983 in what he described as a small ancient church with no local congregation. I am a priest at large."
Okay, so we also have a Christian priest, validly ordained or not, supporting neo-Nazis. That's what I would call a disappointing revelation.
Wow. In hindsight, the disappointing revelation that sea monkeys don't really look like the fanciful underwater creatures in the ads is just peanuts compared to the disappointing revelations about their creator. It turns out he's a supporter of neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and despite that he's ethnically Jewish, he's also a Christian priest? What a bizarre combination.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to imagine that combination of factors in one person. I really hate interpreting other people's beliefs and choices in terms of psychological factors, but I can only imagine that there was a powerful set of psychological factors at play here, very likely including some kind of weird self-loathing.
So let's move on to the faith perspective. What can we say about sea monkeys and Harold von Braunhut here?
Well, sea monkeys themselves, good. Brine shrimp are God's creatures, just like any others. On the other hand, marketing brine shrimp in a way that potentially misleads customers, not so good. Nazism and neo-Nazism, bad. And not just bad, evil. Racism, evil. It's directly contrary to Jesus' command of universal love for everyone, and you can check out episode 55 of the Jimmy Akin podcast for more on that. And supporting Nazism and racism as a Christian priest, evil. Yet, as I mentioned, there are likely powerful psychological factors at play in Harold von Braunhut's case, and they may have diminished his responsibility so that he wasn't fully culpable for these things. And I'd encourage listeners to pray for his soul, since he passed on to his reward in 2003 at the age of 77.
Let's close by saying a few words about sea monkeys themselves from the reason perspective. In light of what we know about Harold von Braunhut, can they still be enjoyed and appreciated?
Well, sea monkeys aren't something that everyone is interested in to begin with, and after learning about Harold von Braunhut, some people may be even less interested. If you were a super sea monkey fan and the disappointing revelations in this episode have ruined them for you, well, I apologize. That wasn't my intent. As always, I just wanted to delve into a compelling mystery, and that sometimes means learning things we didn't want to know. I feel the weight of these revelations myself, but it's my philosophy that we're better off knowing than not knowing. And this way, we know about the need to pray for Harold von Braunhut's soul. At the same time, a lot of people still enjoy and are enthusiastic about sea monkeys. There are sea monkey fans all over the world, and I don't think they're wrong. Even if Harold von Braunhut was a very flawed individual, it's very possible that he was trapped by psychological factors and was not fully responsible for his choices. And even if he was, his personal flaws don't stain the idea of brine shrimp, which are God's creatures, or the activity of celebrating and enjoying them, even under the branding of sea monkeys. Because once you know that they don't really look like the creatures in the ads, they're still really cool and you can enjoy them. And von Braunhut's widow, Yolanda Signorelli, seems to be devoting the profits from them to a good cause. You'll recall that the official Sea Monkey website said,
"She's not only kept the Sea Monkey's empire alive, but also dedicated proceeds to a nature preserve on the Potomac River in Maryland. An ardent vegan and animal rights activist, Yolanda views sea monkeys as goodwill ambassadors for a better world."
And I don't see why sea monkeys should be defined by unfortunate past associations. They can still be goodwill ambassadors as parts of God's creation and nature that can delight adults and children today. If you're a parent, just make sure that you let your children know that the advertisements are just pretend. They don't really look like that. So we need to appreciate them for what they are. And there are a lot of sea monkey fans, including adult sea monkey fans across the world. In fact, we'll have a link to a channel called Picocosmos that is devoted to sea monkeys. It's by an Australian gentleman, and he has more than 250,000 subscribers. So that's a testimony to the popularity of sea monkeys and just how compelling it can be to raise and study them. And that's a positive note to end on.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line here?
Sea monkeys are fascinating creatures. They don't look anything like the fantasy pictures of them, but once you know that, you can still appreciate and be enthusiastic about them, as many people are. Harold von Braunhut was a tragic man who had obvious flaws and made very bad choices, but he may not have been fully responsible for them. We can keep him in prayer, and we can still appreciate the sea monkeys that he popularized.
And what further resources can we offer to the listeners and viewers?
We'll have links to the official Sea Monkey website, also the Picocosmos channel, information about brine shrimp, sea monkeys specifically, information about Harold von Braunhut, a link to information about the Amazing Live Sea Monkeys TV show, and a link to a playlist of the videos of the episodes that were part of that series, as well as the 1988 Washington Post article.
All right. Now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. This feedback comes from our episode number 387 on John Hendrix, the Tennessee Prophet. The first one comes from Father Tim Siegert via email. He says, "Hello, Jimmy and Dom. I've been a huge fan of your show for a long time. Thanks for the great work both of you do. I have a question about something sort of tangential you brought up in regards to the Tennessee Prophet, John Hendrix. You mentioned that he was divorced and remarried, and then brought up how this affects Catholics differently than it does Protestants. A few follow-up questions in that regard. Since a Protestant typically wouldn't resort to a Catholic marriage tribunal to find out the validity of a first marriage, what other means would they have to determine validity or not of their marriage? I've always thought of our Lord's words in verses such as Matthew 18:9, Luke 16:18, etc., as divine law and thus not able to be skirted in any way. I would assume many Protestants would agree with this. Why might John Hendrix, a presumably Bible-believing Christian, still enter a second marriage, assuming good faith? What resources helped you think through your answer to this question? I'm interested in reading them myself. Thank you for taking the time to consider my questions."
Okay, well, you're right. Protestants typically don't use Catholic marriage tribunals to figure out if previous marriages were valid or not. The only time they typically do that is if they're like married to or wanting to get married to a Catholic. So in Protestant circles, extracting that part of those possibilities, they basically rely on the guidance of their church and what their church has taught them about marriage and divorce and its acceptability. And they may talk to their pastor, or they may just make decisions themselves based on what they've been taught. Typically, in Protestant circles, and this is not universal because nothing is universal in Protestantism, but typically in Protestant circles, they have a much more relaxed view of divorce and remarriage. They will look in particular at what are known as the acceptive clauses in Matthew. In Matthew, Jesus is depicted as saying, if you divorce your wife, except for, the Greek word is porneia, and marry another, then you're committing adultery. And they look at that except for porneia and interpret it very broadly. So in a lot of Protestant translations, it'll say like, except for unchastity. And so any kind of unchaste behavior could become a pretext for divorce. Now, there are other interpretations of the acceptive clauses. You'll notice they appear only in Matthew, and everywhere else that that discusses divorce and remarriage in the New Testament contains no exceptions. Mark doesn't contain exceptions. Luke doesn't contain exceptions. Paul in Romans doesn't contain exceptions. In every other case, remarriage after divorce is understood as adultery, period. But for some reason, Matthew has these acceptive clauses. Why might he have them? Well, there are some possibilities, but one is based on the fact Matthew was written for an audience of Jewish Christians, and it contains a righteous man who was planning on a divorce, Saint Joseph. Because when he learned that Mary was pregnant and he wasn't the father, Matthew says he was a righteous man and he planned to divorce her quietly rather than putting her to a public shame. Okay, so why might Matthew alone mention some kind of exception to divorce and remarriage? Well, he's got Saint Joseph right there, and he's already portrayed him as a righteous man. So he could be inclined to say, hey, if you divorce someone except for, some kind of sexual sin, you're making them commit adultery when they get remarried. Well, why would this be an exception? Because you're not making them an adulterer. They're already an adulterer. And so you're not compelling them into a life of adultery. They've already chosen that. And so you could divorce someone in that situation. This interpretation, for example, was very popular among the church fathers. There are other interpretations too, but what the Protestant community has as a general characteristic is their interpretations of divorce and remarriage tend to be much more relaxed than the Catholic understanding. In terms of what resources did I use to think through this? Well, on the canon law side, I used the Code of Canon Law. I also used basic moral theology for like evaluating what level of responsibility would John Hendrix have had, just basic principles about conscience and knowing how he would have been educated and so forth. And I've also read extensively on this subject over the last 30 years. So I didn't really consult any written resources. I just drew on memory for putting the pieces together in John Hendrix's case. And I hope that's helpful.
Our next feedback comes from Discartiptics on our Discord server. He writes, I'm kind of torn. I love the podcast a lot, but I'm not a fan of the pro-Confederate stuff in the latest episode.
Well, I'm really glad you love the show. That's great. Thank you so much for that. I never expect people to agree with me. I present different ideas for people to think about, and then I leave it to them to decide what they think about them. And if they disagree, I'm fine with that. I think disagreement and debate is healthy, and so I want to encourage you in that regard. What I myself would disagree with is the idea that I included anything in the episode that was pro-Confederate. My first thought was like, what pro-Confederate stuff? I can understand why some people might think differently. Many people today only know about the Civil War because of our public school system and our college school system and the media, and all three of those are partisan institutions today that deliver highly partisan narratives. But there are usually two or more sides to every story, and most people have never heard any other narrative about the Civil War than the one offered in the American educational system and the media. And if you've never even tried to think things through from another perspective, well, doing that could sound pro-Confederate to you. But part of what I do on Mysterious World is try to think through all of the perspectives, including unfamiliar ones. That doesn't mean I approve of them. When I discuss how the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Romans regarded something, that doesn't mean I agree with them. And the same is true here. When I think about the Civil War and surrounding events, I think about them from multiple perspectives: Black, white, and Native American. For example, in episode 211 on Harriet Tubman, I looked at them from a Black perspective. In episode 387 on John Hendrix, well, he was white and was born right after the war in a Mid-South state, and those facts affected his life. So to try to illuminate John Hendrix, I looked at them from that perspective. The Civil War was a complex reality, and I by no means agree with everything people on either side of the war thought, said, or did. I disapprove of a bunch of it. But what I try to do is think through and present everyone's perspective in a balanced way. So in that episode, I wanted to illustrate John Hendrix by showing how divided the situation was he grew up in. So I mentioned that John Hendrix had both Union supporters and Confederate supporters among his relatives, and that was balanced. I mentioned that the man that John Hendrix killed was a bully who was a former Confederate. So I wasn't trying to cover up misdeeds by former Confederates. And to illustrate the divided nature of things, I explored why John Hendrix's home state of Tennessee seceded. I mentioned that they initially voted to stay in the Union, which is something they really did. I mean, they took a vote, and it was in favor of staying in the Union. They only voted to secede after President Lincoln decided to wage war against the South and demanded that they raise soldiers for this effort. So I was seeking to be balanced and fairly represent what actually happened in history. I also noted that ending slavery, which was the redeeming feature of the war, did not become a war goal until 1863, which was 2 years into the conflict. Furthermore, Abraham Lincoln had been promising to leave slavery totally alone before that, and he'd even supported a constitutional amendment to enshrine the right of states to have slavery, which meant that none of the Northern soldiers before 1863 were fighting to end slavery. They had other reasons for fighting. And it also means that none of the Southern soldiers before 1863 were simply fighting to preserve slavery. A large majority of Southerners didn't even own slaves. They also had other reasons for fighting. What I was doing was revealing that the Civil War was much more complex than many people today are aware, and revealing historical realities that are more complex than what people think. In other words, revealing mysteries is part of what I do on this program. We need to resist and think through the often simplistic cartoon narratives that we're presented with. That doesn't mean that I wholesale approve of any historical situation, and that's not what I was doing here. If a listener thinks that I was doing that, I'd suggest them to review my approach and listen carefully to what I actually said. So I hope this helps and offers some additional perspective.
Very good. And thank you, everyone, for your feedback. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about the amazing sea monkeys and their outrageous creator, Harold von Braunhut? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. Check it out by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. Be sure and help me by liking the video, commenting on it, sharing it with others, and especially by subscribing. We're trying to get to 200,000 subscribers, and be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video.
I also want to thank Rob Mady for his voiceover work on this episode. And Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next Friday is the day after Christmas, so we're going to be doing an episode of Christmas Weird Questions. We'll be considering questions like, how many souls do twins have before the egg splits? If someone is born on Ash Wednesday, what does that mean for their fasting requirements, depending on what time of day they were born? What would have happened if Luther had reformed within the church? Can a living person's spirit possess another living person? Can a parent's desire to baptize a child count for that child's salvation? If someone was excommunicated unfairly, can they still go to heaven? Can damned souls or demons ever repent? And more.
Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where, as he said, you should hit that bell to get notifications. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/396. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by the Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at gradygroupinc.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dot.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.